In the shadowed heart of the Appalachian Mountains, where mist clung to ancient pines like forgotten spirits, lay a truth whispered only by the wind through hollow ravines. Elias Thorne, a man whose hands bore the rough marks of a life spent in solitude, knew these whispers better than most. He'd built his cabin, a defiant speck of civilization, deep within the tangled wilderness of Blackwood Gulch, seeking refuge from a world that had long since forgotten his name. His only companions were the rustle of leaves, the distant call of an owl, and the ever-present, unsettling silence that swallowed all other sounds. Elias was no stranger to hardship. He'd survived blizzards that buried his cabin in snow for weeks, endured lean winters where hunger gnawed at his belly, and faced down predators with nothing but a well-aimed shot and unwavering resolve. But what began to stir in Blackwood Gulch that late autumn was unlike any challenge he'd ever known. It started subtly, an almost imperceptible shift in the mountain's rhythm. The usual nighttime chorus of crickets and frogs slowly faded, replaced by an unnatural stillness. Animals, once bold in their pursuit of food, vanished, leaving behind only the unsettling absence of their presence. Then came the dreams, not the fleeting, disjointed images of sleep, but vivid, terrifying narratives that played out with agonizing clarity. He saw towering, skeletal figures with eyes of burning embers, their forms shifting like smoke in the wind. They moved through the gnarled woods, their presence heralded by an icy chill that permeated his very bones. In these nightmares he was always running, always hiding, but their whispers, a language of dread he couldn't comprehend, always found him. He'd wake in a cold sweat, the oppressive silence of his cabin more terrifying than any phantom sound. Elias, a man grounded in the tangible, tried to rationalize it. Stress, isolation, the wild's inherent ability to play tricks on the mind. He told himself it was all a product of his own making, a consequence of his retreat from society. Yet the feeling of being watched intensified. He'd catch glimpses of movement in his periphery, shadows that stretched too long, branches that swayed when there was no breeze. One evening, as he sat by the dying embers of his fire, a faint scratching echoed from the wall behind him. It was rhythmic, persistent, like something trying to claw its way in. He grabbed his old hunting rifle, its weight a familiar comfort, and slowly approached the wall, his heart hammering against his ribs. The scratching stopped abruptly as he reached it, leaving only the sound of his ragged breath in the suffocating quiet. He spent the rest of the night with his back against the wall, rifle across his lap, eyes wide and scanning the oppressive darkness. The next morning, driven by a gnawing unease, Elias decided to venture deeper into the gulch than he ever had before. He needed answers, something tangible to dispel the creeping dread. He packed a meager supply of jerky and water, his rifle, and a worn compass that had guided him through countless hunts. The air grew colder the further he went, the sunlight struggling to penetrate the thick canopy of ancient trees. The forest floor was strangely devoid of life. No scurrying squirrels, no chirping birds, just a carpet of decaying leaves that muffled his footsteps. The silence was profound, broken only by the occasional snap of a twig under his worn boots. As he moved deeper, the trees began to twist into grotesque shapes, their branches skeletal fingers reaching towards the perpetually overcast sky. He stumbled upon an old, overgrown logging trail, barely visible beneath layers of moss and fallen leaves. Following it, he found himself in a small clearing, dominated by an enormous, ancient oak. Its trunk was impossibly wide, its branches scarred and gnarled, and a dark, almost black sap oozed from a gaping wound in its bark, staining the ground beneath it like dried blood. A shiver, independent of the cold, ran down Elias's spine. There was something profoundly wrong with this tree, something ancient and malevolent. As he stood there, a faint, almost imperceptible humming began to emanate from the oak, a low vibration that seemed to resonate in his teeth. Then, from the undergrowth around the clearing, he heard it, a soft, slithering sound, like something impossibly heavy dragging itself through the dead leaves. He spun around, rifle raised, his eyes darting frantically. Nothing, just the oppressive stillness and the unwavering, malevolent hum of the ancient tree. But he knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that he was no longer alone. The slithering sound grew louder, circling him, though he saw nothing. It was as if the very air around the ancient oak had solidified into an invisible, predatory presence. Elias backed away slowly, his rifle still aimed at the unseen threat, his boots crunching loudly on the dry leaves. The humming from the tree intensified, vibrating through the soles of his feet and up into his teeth, a sound that felt less like an auditory sensation and more like an internal tremor. The air grew impossibly heavy, thick with a scent he couldn't quite place, damp earth, something metallic, and a cloying sweetness that made his stomach lurch. Suddenly, a branch, thick as a man's thigh, snapped from a nearby pine and crashed to the ground with a deafening crack, startling him. Elias spun towards the sound, but there was no wind, no discernible cause. When he turned back to the clearing, a new horror awaited him. From the dark sap oozing from the ancient oak, forms were coalescing. Not fully solid, but shimmering, semi-transparent shapes that writhed and stretched, like shadows given a grotesque, fleeting life. They were vaguely humanoid, but elongated, contorted, their limbs shifting and blurring. And then, he saw the eyes, points of malevolent, glowing amber that fixed on him with an unnerving intensity. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through his practiced calm. These were the figures from his dreams, no longer confined to the realm of sleep. He raised his rifle, fumbling for the safety, his hands shaking. He wanted to scream, to run, but his feet felt rooted to the spot, held captive by a terror more profound than any he had ever known. He fired. The shot echoed deafeningly through the silent forest, a pathetic protest against the impossible. The bullet tore through one of the shimmering forms, passing through it without impact, as if it were made of smoke. The hum from the tree pulsed, growing louder, and the translucent figures seemed to laugh, a soundless, psychic reverberation that clawed at his mind. Elias broke. He turned and ran, blindly crashing through the undergrowth, the impossible shapes pursuing him with a silent, relentless speed. He didn't know where he was going, only that he had to escape. Branches lashed at his face, roots tripped him, but he scrambled onward, adrenaline coursing through his veins. The air behind him grew colder, the humming from the oak fading but replaced by a chilling whisper that seemed to come from all directions, a cacophony of unseen voices speaking a language of dread. He ran until his lungs burned and his legs screamed in protest, until the forest began to thin and a faint, blessed light filtered through the canopy. He burst into a small, familiar clearing, stumbling and falling to his knees, gasping for air. His cabin. He had made it. He scrambled to his feet, eyes darting back towards the tree-line, half expecting the shimmering horrors to emerge. But the forest remained still, the silence now a welcome balm after the psychic assault. He barricaded the door, his hands still trembling, and slumped against it, fighting to regain control. He was safe for now, but the encounter had irrevocably shattered his world. The solitude he had sought was now a prison, and the wilderness he had loved had revealed a terrifying, ancient secret. He knew, with a dreadful certainty, that this was just the beginning. The things in the gulch, the things from his nightmares, had stirred, and they had found him. As night fell, a new sound permeated the oppressive silence, a faint, rhythmic scratching at the outer walls of his cabin, echoing the sound he had heard days earlier. It was no longer a mystery. They were here, and they were waiting. The scratching intensified, moving from the walls to the roof, then to the heavy wooden door, a chilling symphony of unseen claws scraping against timber. Elias huddled in the center of his cabin, the rifle clutched to his chest, its cold steel a meager comfort against the creeping dread. He lit every lamp and candle he possessed, desperate for light to push back the encroaching darkness, but the shadows in the corners of the room seemed to deepen, to pulse with an unseen malevolence. The air grew heavy, pregnant with an unnatural chill that seeped into his bones, despite the roaring fire in the hearth. He knew he couldn't stay like this. a hunted animal trapped in its den. His supplies were dwindling, and even if they weren't, the psychological toll of being under siege by unseen entities would break him. He needed a plan. But what plan could contend with beings that defied the laws of physics, that could pass through solid objects and attack the very fabric of his sanity? Hours crawled by, each minute an eternity. The scratching faded with the first hint of dawn, replaced by an unsettling, profound silence. Elias, exhausted and on edge, risked a glance outside. The forest appeared normal, bathed in the pale light of morning, but he saw the signs. Scorch marks marred the bark of the nearest trees, small, blackened patches that looked as though something impossibly cold had touched them. And on the ground, scattered around the perimeter of his cabin, were strange, crystalline shards, black as obsidian, glinting dully in the morning light. He recognized them. They were identical to the substance oozing from the ancient oak. A horrifying realization dawned on him. The creatures weren't merely shadows or spirits. They were tangible in some way, leaving behind physical traces. This meant they could be fought, perhaps even harmed, though his rifle had proved useless. But what could harm them? His mind raced, desperate for an answer, sifting through forgotten folklore and local legends he'd dismissed as childish tales. The old mountain folk spoke of shadow walkers and spirit wood, entities that guarded ancient places, capable of stealing the warmth from a man's soul. They also spoke of iron, of salt, of fire, old wards against the unknown. He decided to act. He spent the day meticulously fortifying his cabin. He hammered old railroad spikes he'd collected into the doorframe and windowsills, hoping the iron would deter whatever was out there. He sprinkled a thick line of rock salt around the perimeter of his cabin. A desperate, superstitious act. He sharpened his hunting knife, a last resort against an enemy he still barely understood. As dusk approached, a new sound began to filter through the trees. A low, guttural growl, unlike any animal he'd ever heard. It was deep, resonant, and filled with a predatory hunger. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, surrounding the cabin. This was different from the whispers and the scratching. This was raw, primal menace. He saw movement at the edge of the tree-line, not the shimmering forms from the oak, but something heavier, darker. Shapes like hunched figures, moving on all fours, their forms indistinct in the deepening twilight. Their eyes, though distant, glowed with that familiar, terrifying amber. Elias braced himself, rifle raised, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. The growling grew louder, closer. He knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the bone, that tonight would be different. Tonight they wouldn't just scratch at his walls. Tonight they would try to get in, and he would have to fight, not just for his life, but for his sanity against the encroaching darkness of Blackwood Gulch. The low growls outside Elias's cabin escalated into a chorus of guttural snarls, punctuated by the snapping of twigs and the rustling of unseen bodies in the undergrowth. The faint amber glows at the tree-line multiplied, now visible as dozens of predatory eyes encircling his small refuge. These weren't the ethereal, shimmering figures of the ancient oak. These were something else entirely, creatures of flesh and nightmare, driven by a tangible hunger. They moved with an unsettling fluidity, their hunched forms occasionally silhouetted against the pale moonlight, massive and brutish. Elias peered through a crack in his boarded-up window, the rifle trembling in his hands. He could make out their general shape now, bipedal, but with unnaturally long arms that nearly scraped the ground, and heads that seemed to meld seamlessly into their hunched shoulders. Their fur, or whatever covered them, was ragged and dark, almost absorbing the meager light. A wave of profound fear, cold and heavy, washed over him. These were not animals he recognized. These were things from a primordial darkness, awakened by the stirring of the gulch. A thunderous crash against the front door jolted him, splintering the old wood. The iron spikes held, for now, but the force of the impact shook the entire cabin. He stumbled back, raising his rifle. Another crash, and another, relentless blows that threatened to tear the door from its hinges. The growls outside morphed into frustrated roars, echoing through the night. He heard the sickening scrape of claws on the roof, the heavy thud of bodies landing on the porch. They were everywhere. He fired through a small gap in the window boards, aiming blindly at one of the amber eyes. A shriek, raw and chilling, pierced the night, followed by a heavy thud. He'd hit something. A fleeting sense of triumph surged through him, quickly overshadowed by renewed dread. One down, how many more? And would they truly be deterred? The attacks continued, probes at every weak point of his cabin. He heard the creak of logs as something tried to pry them apart, the scraping of claws seeking purchase on the stone chimney. The salt line, he realized with a sinking heart, was doing nothing against these physical aggressors. The iron spikes seemed to hold them at bay, at least momentarily, but he knew it was only a matter of time. Then the cabin went dark. The lamps, one by one, flickered and died, as if an unseen force had snuffed them out. The fire in the hearth dwindled, its warmth rapidly receding, leaving him in suffocating blackness. The chill intensified, and he heard a new sound, not a growl, but a low, guttural chittering from within the cabin itself. He spun around, rifle raised, his heart pounding a frantic rhythm against his ribs. The glowing amber eyes were now inside, 2 sets of them, just beyond the dying embers of the fire. They were tall, much taller than he had imagined, and their forms seemed to shimmer and waver in the near-total darkness, like heat haze. These weren't the brutish things from outside. These were the shadow walkers, the ethereal horrors from the ancient oak. They had passed through his defenses as if they were made of mist. A whisper, cold and utterly devoid of warmth, slithered into his mind, clear as if spoken directly into his ear. You disturbed us. You awakened us. This place is ours. Elias stumbled backward, tripping over a loose floorboard. The rifle clattered to the ground. Forgotten. He scrambled to retrieve it, but his hands were shaking too violently. The 2 figures advanced, their glowing eyes fixed on him. He could feel their coldness, a pervasive chill that seeped into his very soul. They were not merely physical threats. They were psychic predators, feeding on his fear. He closed his eyes, clenching his fists, desperate for a way out. He had fought beasts, blizzards, hunger, but this was beyond anything he could comprehend. Just as despair threatened to swallow him whole, a faint memory surfaced, a forgotten scrap of folklore from an old hunter he'd met years ago. They hate the light, the old ones, the true light. He opened his eyes, scanning the darkness, a desperate plan forming in his mind. He still had a few flares, meant for signaling in emergencies. Not the true light of the sun, but perhaps enough. With a surge of renewed, desperate hope, he lunged for his pack, fumbling for the emergency flares, knowing that this was his last, desperate chance. Elias's fingers fumbled frantically in his pack, his eyes darting between the 2 shimmering figures now barely 10 feet away. Their amber eyes glowed with an unnerving intensity, and the cold radiating from them was so profound it felt like a physical blow. The chittering within his mind intensified, a cacophony of ancient voices whispering promises of oblivion. He found one of the flares, ripped off the cap, and with a desperate prayer, struck the igniter. With a hiss and a blinding flash, the flare ignited, casting a harsh, crimson light that instantly banished the shadows in the cabin. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The 2 shimmering figures recoiled as if struck, their forms flickering violently. The chittering in Elias's mind ceased, replaced by a high-pitched, almost inaudible screech of pure agony. The air in the cabin warmed perceptibly, and the oppressive chill began to recede. He scrambled to his feet, holding the blazing flare aloft like a torch. The creatures, no longer semi-transparent, were now distinct, though still horrifying. They were tall and emaciated, their skin stretched taut over skeletal frames, their limbs impossibly long and spindly. Their heads were smooth, featureless save for the glowing amber eyes. The light from the flare seemed to burn them, causing them to writhe and contort. They let out another silent shriek, a sound that ripped through Elias's perception, a scream of pure, unadulterated pain. The brutish creatures outside, meanwhile, were reacting to the light as well. Through the cracks in his boarded windows, Elias saw them recoil, their growls turning into whimpers of distress. They scrambled away from the cabin, disappearing back into the deeper shadows of the woods. It seemed the true light, even from a chemical flare, was indeed anathema to them all. Elias stumbled towards the door, holding the flare out like a weapon. The two shadow walkers inside shrieked again, their forms blurring, attempting to dissipate back into the unseen. But the light held them. He knew this wouldn't last. The flare had a limited burn time. He had to get out now while the light still offered him protection. He fumbled with the makeshift barricades on the door, his hands still trembling, but with renewed purpose. He tore away the boards, the sound of splintering would echoing in the suddenly quiet cabin. As he pulled the last board free, the flare began to sputter, its brilliant crimson light dimming. Panic flared again, sharp and cold, with a final, desperate burst of energy. He threw open the door and burst out into the pre-dawn gloom, the sputtering flare held high. The forest was eerily silent, the amber eyes gone. He ran, not towards the main trail, but deeper into the gulch, hoping to use the remaining light of the flare to guide him away from the ancient oak, away from the source of the evil. He knew he couldn't return to his cabin, not now. It was tainted, marked. He ran until the flare died, plunging him into the profound darkness of the pre-dawn wilderness. He was alone, hunted, and adrift in a world far more terrifying than he had ever imagined. But he was alive, and as the first faint hints of true dawn began to paint the eastern sky, Elias Thorne, a man who had faced the true darkness of Blackwood Gulch, knew one thing with chilling certainty. He had survived this night, but the fight for his soul, and perhaps the very soul of the mountains, had just begun. He would find answers. He would find a way to fight back.